What a privilege it is to be joined by Corne Bekker. And Corne, I want to hear your story.
Jonathan, thank you for the time to spend with you. There's nothing more powerful than God's choice upon our lives. I grew up in a small mining town in the western side, northwest province now, kind of Western Transvaal before that time, and grew up in kind of just an ordinary Afrikaans family with not a lot of aspirations. But growing up within the Dutch Reformed community, very early on I had a deep sense that there must be more to life. Obviously, there needs to be more. And at the age of 13, we suffered a devastating loss of the death of my father. And it was at that time, it's always interesting to me how an encounter with death can kind of clarify things for you. And I remember at the age of 13, kind of turning towards God and saying, there has to be more to life than this. And it was at that time that I had a radical conversion experience. I call this my first conversion. And at that point in time, in actual fact, the plan was not to enter into teaching or ministry. It certainly was not. I was one of those terminally shy kids, strong introvert, kind of semi-hermit maybe. And Jonathan, I remember very vividly at that point in time, I prayed to God, a prayer that I really didn't mean. And sometimes we pray those prayers, it just sounds nice. And I remember, this is what I said to the Lord. I said, I'll do anything and I'll go anywhere except for two things. I don't want to pray in front of people and I don't want to speak in front of people. But anything else I will do. And of course it is interesting that those are the only two things He's ever asked me to do. I learned very early on not to bargain with God because we will lose every single time. And so finished my matriculation. And then sensed that there was a deep call to the ministry. And initially, I had no desire to go to university whatsoever. Actually, in fact, all that I wanted to do was to go to Bible school. And I looked for the shortest possible Bible school that I could find. At that time, I thought 2 parts of God's name is go. And so I just wanted to go into the mission field. But my mother was very strong about this. And she said, you can go anywhere as long as you have a degree. And I remember initially I went and really had no direction. And once again I did a very dangerous thing. I said, God, what do you want me to do? And I felt strongly at that point in time that I had to study languages. And so spent some time in Greek and Hebrew and Arabic and Latin and a few other languages. And then when I was done, went back to Bible school. Very, very excited. Thought God's going to send me to the mission field. And it was really during the second year I finished Bible school and then had the opportunity to go on a trip overseas. And at that point in time, I made the quality decision not to enter ministry. And the reason for that was my eyes were open to the church. And that I thought that ministry is an invitation to pain. If you deal with people, you're going to be injured one way or another. And I remembered on that trip I had what I call my second conversion, which was a conversion to obedience. I don't want to go into detail, but ended up in a little town in Italy, and in a church, really was not planning on that, had an encounter with God, and saw Him for who He was. And the only option at that point in time, Jonathan, was to say yes. And out of that, I felt the call to go back to university, and after many years got involved in teaching and serving the church. And about 10 years ago, I received another call from the Lord. And it's always interesting how these calls can humble us. For the longest time, I made fun of people that went to America. I publicly made fun of them. I used to say, not called by God, called by the dollar. And I remember when God started to speak to my wife and I, that there was a further call to go to the United States, and in essence to go as missionaries. It took me about 2 years to be obedient to that call again. It seems to be a refrain in my life.
Was there a specific thing that happened that helped you to be obedient after 2 years?
I had an encounter with God during a church service, Jonathan, in which I once again saw God for who He was. And I'm a firm believer in the value of the fear of God. This is something that we don't often speak about. And sometimes we separate the fear of God from the love of the Lord. And even sometimes in our preaching, we do a lot of what I call exegetical hermeneutics and kind of jumping through hoops in order to explain that the fear of God is not really fear, but respect. But of course, the Hebrew word for fear is fear, and the Greek word for fear is fear indeed. And it's a healthy understanding of who God is. And I had that encounter with God, Jonathan, and I realized there really is no option. You know, we often think in the Christian life we have an option.
No, of course, we should have an option.
Not really. It took me the longest time to recognize that the last choice that I had was when I said yes to God, when I became a Christian. If He is indeed Lord, that He can do with me whatever He pleases. And so through a number of miraculous, absolute miraculous events, God transferred us to America, which is something that at that point in time was absolutely impossible. Got a position at Regent University as a professor, once again something that I never imagined, something that I planned for. Actually, in fact, I never even applied for the job, I think. It's just one of those things that simply happened. And in the last 10 years, God has placed us in a great church and have opened numerous countries for us. Again, when I left for America, I thought, I'm not sure. You know, you go to a country where nobody knows you, in essence, you start afresh. And one of the biggest questions was if ministry would continue. And I found in the last 10 years that the doors simply just opened, doors that I could never ever open. Invitations to speak to the headquarters of the FBI and lecturing at in Quantico, the Marine College, doors opening in China and Taiwan and Germany and Norway and the UK and Canada and literally all over America. And Jonathan, the great lesson that I learned from that is that God's plans are always more powerful than ours. And the great secret of life is to open our ears and to listen. And when we hear, to trust, to obey, and to say yes.
Wow, that's incredible. Just talk about your life now.
Right.
You're married, you've got
Right.
kids.
Correct.
And what do you feel God is doing now? Not only in your life, but in your family's life.
Right. Well, one God, one wife, and one kid. We have one. If we survive him, there might be a second one, but the jury is still out on that. He's 13 years old now. Although I teach at Regent University, and I teach in two programs. I teach in New Testament and church leadership, which is something that I'm absolutely passionate about. My heart is for the church. God's plan for the world remains with the local church. And for the last 10 years, I found my feet planted firmly within the academy, but firmly within the church as well. And as a family, God has really given us a deep love for local churches. In the city that I stay in, Virginia Beach, I work with about 50 odd churches. And typically are in those churches once a month. Once a month I'm in one or two churches, but once a year I'm in all 50 churches. And then a number of churches around the world. What God's doing with us at the moment is to plant within us this firm love for the restoration of His church as a place where the kingship of Jesus would be accepted and proclaimed. Christ is coming back, not for organizations, not even for universities, not even for ministries, but He's coming back for the church. And the biggest thing that God has done, actual fact, in our family is to prepare us to serve in His church and to build up His church. My wife is actively involved in ministry, and my son as well. He serves on a Sunday. It's always interesting. He, in one of the campuses of the church that we serve in, he organizes the slides for worship, and At times, and he takes it really seriously, and many times he said to me, this is as important as the preaching that you do. And of course he's right. He really is right. And so what God's placed within us is a deep love for the restoration of God's church. The church would be a healthy place where Christ indeed would be lifted up.
I'd love to talk just a bit more about the fear of God. Because it is something that a lot of people misinterpret.
Right.
It's a lot of people that the word fear brings worry inside of them. And why should I fear God? He should be a loving Father. How do you explain God the Father as a loving Father, but that we need to fear God?
Right. Well, I think one of the mistakes that we've made is that we've mistaken what fear is. And fear, very similarly than love, there is a spectrum here. Love can turn to lust. If love is focused on the wrong thing, it can turn bad, it can turn evil. And in the same way, for the longest time, Satan has desired for us to fear him. So if you watch Hollywood horror movies, right, this is the idea. We're supposed to be afraid of the dark and be afraid of Satan. But the great secret in life is to recognize that there is a healthy side to fear. And that we were only supposed to fear God and nothing else. John Wesley famously said, give me 100 people that love nothing but God and fear nothing but God, and I will shake this world. There's a healthy side where we see God for who he is. In both the Old and New Testaments, we have beautiful names for God that describes this. In the Old Testament, there's only one time where God is called the fear of Isaac. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul makes the following statement. He says, knowing the terror of God, I persuade men. What an incredible statement. The bigger question for me is, how do we get the fear of God? How do we get that healthy fear of God? And it's more than respect. To see God for who he is. And it's not separated from his love. It's not separated from his compassion. Of course, what we tend to do is that we create a God in our own image. Blaise Pascal, again, famously said that God created man in his image and we return to favor. So we create a God that fits our model. But once you see God for who he is, that his love and his compassion and his wrath are all wrapped together into one great mystery. And it's not a mystery that cannot be known. Mystery can be known, but by the heart. And once we see that, there is a healthy understanding of who God is. The bigger question for me, Jonathan, is how do we get the fear of God? David writes in Psalms 34, it's beautiful. He says, come, children, let me teach you the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is taught. And sometimes I think it's this. It's to go to my son and say, let me help you understand how big God is. I often think that the big shock in heaven will not be the gold streets. It will not be the buildings. I think the big shock in heaven will be when we see God for who he is. I have a strange imagination, Jonathan. Sometimes I think we will wake up in heaven and see God and die on the spot, and he will have to resurrect us again. Maybe this will go on and on. I can imagine us walking up to our friends in heaven and saying, did you know how large God is and didn't tell me? Did you allow me to live the way that I live, not knowing who the Lord is? And once we see the holiness of God, and once we see how large God is, and how powerful and how majestic and how glorious he is, there's a natural fear of God that comes, which is healthy and redemptive and balanced and transformative and compelling, that puts us indeed on the right trajectory for life. As Solomon said, indeed it's the beginning of wisdom. Once you see God for who he is, you know it's the right thing to do.
How do you then have the focus on getting the fear of God without focusing on the emotion of fear?
Right. Well, what we have to remember again, there's a trajectory here, maybe a spectrum. Fear that is not focused on God is non-redemptive. It is paralyzing. It is evil. It destroys us. But when we have the fear of God, in actual fact, it motivates us. I often say, famously in the church that I serve in, I said, the secret to a happy marriage is big fear of God, little fear of wife. That means a small little fear. It's not that there should be no fear, there should be a healthy respect for what you can see. And in similar ways, when you recognize how large God is and yet understands that within that He loves us and that He has compassion upon us, that He has the power and the right to destroy us because of our sin, He doesn't. And He reaches out and forgives us and cleanses us and purifies us. Something extraordinary happens. The question, of course, is how do we get it? As a young kid, the first time I read the book of Revelation, it really worried me. When I got to that portion in chapter 4 where John sees the four living creatures around the throne of God. And I don't know if you remember that John said they had eyes everywhere. And I remember as a young kid, 13, 14 years old, I said, oh God, I don't want to see this. This would really worry me. Anything with more than two eyes upsets me a little bit. And it took me a long time to recognize that the reason why the four living creatures had eyes everywhere is that two eyes were not enough to see God. To worship is to be all eyes. To look at Him, to gaze at Him. And when they saw Him for who He really is, they do not stop saying day and night, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And this is how we get the fear of God, when our eyes are open. Sometimes our worship, too many words. We should learn to gaze at Him. And when we gaze at Him, we will see Him and our lives will be transformed.
Thank you so much, Corne. That's really encouraging. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's a pleasure.